Okay, we're good.
All right, so welcome everyone. I'm delighted that you could join us for this Rumi Forum, an evening conversation on the challenges to Christianity in America, lessons for other faith communities. I noted in the flyer that the way it presented the evening was that the first part of the evening that there would be a reception, and then this would be followed by the main event. And I was kind of struck by the phrase main event. That is to say, I'm hoping this isn't too pugnacious a conversation, but a more ironic discussion of some important issues related to religion and American culture. My name is Bill Dingus. I'm a professor at Catholic University here in Washington, DC, and I will act as the moderator for our discussion. We will proceed as follows. I'm going to introduce each of our speakers, and then they will do a approximate 10-15 minute presentation. And this then, after all three have finished, this will be followed by a general discussions, and I invite questions from our audience. So, assuming you've got an edit here. Our first speaker is Joel Rainey, who is the lead pastor of Covenant Church in Shepherdstown, West Virginia, which is located in the tri-state area of Maryland, West Virginia, and the Nova, Washington, DC area. He's the author of 3 books. Dr. Rainey is a former missionary and evangelical denominational executive with intercultural experience on 5 continents. He's led efforts to plant more than 100 new evangelical churches in the United States and around the world. He lives in Shepherdstown with his wife, Amy, and their 3 children. Dr. Rainey.
Well, thanks. And good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight. When Razik called me to talk with me about the contribution that maybe I could make to this discussion as an evangelical, I put a nice speech together, actually, with bullet points and everything, and you can see what that has become. Literally on the back of the Clarion Hotel stationery that I was using a couple hours ago in my hotel room. And the reason for that is because between the time that the Rumi Forum asked me to participate in this and this event, there have been 4 major kind of breaking news stories about evangelicalism in America. And so I just kind of want to mention those in brief, just in case there might be people who've been living under a rock who haven't heard about some of these yet. The first one is Michael Gerson's incredibly complex, nuanced, accurate, completely full-board description of evangelicalism in America called The Last Temptation. It appeared in the Atlantic. And that's the one everybody's been talking about. Of course, in addition to that, came right on the heels of it a New York Times piece entitled Why Black Worshipers Are Leaving White Evangelical Churches. I also have a friend who happens to be the president of the King's College, who just last week wrote a piece for the Washington Post entitled What Evangelicals Look Like Before They Enter the Political Fray. And then, of course, a podcast that just recently started. Many of you may know the name Kirsten Powers, very well-known journalist, along with Jonathan Merritt with Religion News Service. They've established a podcast called the Faith Angle Podcast, and their very first guest was Eric Metaxas, a guy who for years had actually been thought of as sort of the thinking man's evangelical, living and writing in New York. He's written some masterful pieces, biographies in particular on subjects like Dietrich Bonhoeffer, William Wilberforce, and most recently Martin Luther, but who came out during the last election fiercely pro-Trump, which shocked a lot of people, and so they got to interview him, and I would commend that podcast as well as that particular episode to everybody, because it was really good. It was incredible and very insightful to actually hear from Eric about what was going on in his mind and heart during all of this. And so as I think about the challenges to evangelical Christianity, I'm thinking perhaps I would have preferred to have talked about the challenges of mainline Protestantism or of Catholicism, because for evangelicals we're up against a bit of a curve right now. And what I would ask everybody to just remember with regard to evagelicalism is the loudest aren't always the best representatives. And so it's a good thing to just kind of keep in mind that when you see a television personality from an evangelical church and they're saying things on a national platform, they're not only are they not always the best representatives, but perhaps even the media themselves wanted more people to tune in, more so. Sometimes we value the circus act more than we value the accuracy. And then, of course, even for the majority of evangelicals, we're not a monolith. I know this is true for my friends at Rumi Forum. They're always having this conversation about their own religion, about Islam. You see one faction, one little slice that happens in one country. That's not necessarily who we are. And I want to reiterate that as a challenge, particularly in an age where evangelical Christians get hit with a magic number that has just been attached to our foreheads since 2016, and that number is 81. 81% of you voted for Donald Trump, and I would tell you that was 81% of white evangelicals in North America. It was not 81% of evangelicals. And then in fairness to even those who voted for the current president, I would say among that 81%, those people are far from a monolith. Some of them, yeah, they think Trump is God's gift to the world and possibly will usher in the great millennial kingdom. I don't know. But for others, they were, in their own minds, voting for the lesser of two evils. Others still had various, the reasons for voting for the current president were, I'm sure, as numerous as the reasons those have for voting for Secretary Clinton. So it's important to keep that in mind. And so with that in mind, I think, well, let me go ahead and say this too. Not everyone who goes to an evangelical church is necessarily a Christ follower either. And so, it's interesting to me, Billy Graham, whose death we recently mourned, once said, and this has only been a couple of decades ago, that if he were to discover that 75% of churchgoers in American evangelical churches didn't make it to heaven, it would not surprise him. And that probably sounds a little harsh, but then I think about my friend DJ Horton, who's out in California, who goes back to that 81% number, and he says, if you actually poll those people about their Bible intake and their prayer concerns, the time they spend with the Lord, the time they spend actually sharing their faith actively, which is really at the core of who evangelicals are supposed to be, you might discover that the overwhelming majority of that 81% are in no way really evangelical, except insofar as they may attend an evangelical church 4 or 5 times a year. So I think in light of all of that, we've got some challenges in terms of how we define ourselves. So there's a twofold challenge that I think evangelicals have. The first is that we have to reestablish our core identity. White evangelicals do a certain thing, black evangelicals do a certain thing. But when we think about evangelical Christians, that term actually has a definition. It was given to us some years ago by a British historian named David Bebbington. He called it the quadrilateral, I'll be able to pronounce it here in a minute, the quadrilateral of priorities. And Bebbington said that an evangelical Christian, whether they're white, black, Hispanic, Asian, Republican, Democrat, rich, poor, wherever they are, and there are evangelicals all over the planet, and many of them here in America, and they're not defined by who they voted for in the last election. They're defined by 4 things. The first is biblicism, an understanding that Scripture has its origins in the breath of God Himself, and that Scripture, as a result, is the infallible Word of God. Secondly is crucicentrism, the belief in the centrality and the necessity of the atoning work of Jesus Christ upon the cross for salvation. Evangelicals are a people who take quite literally the words of the author of Hebrews when he said that without the shedding of blood, there is no forgiveness of sins. And so crucicentrism is central to who we are. Thirdly is conversionism. In order to benefit from that atonement, evangelicals almost in unison believe that one must be born again. And I would just remind anybody listening that phrase didn't originate with us. Jesus Himself said to a religious man, unless you are born again, you will not see the kingdom of God. And so to access that benefit of atonement, evangelicals believe that one must put their faith in that atonement, and that regeneration occurs, and they become a new person. And then finally, activism. It's our job to share that message because we believe it's the most inclusive message on the planet. and share it not just with our words, but with our actions. And if you look back at what evangelicals have done in the past with the institutions that have been established in the history, even on this continent, I think you see that activism come out. The last challenge for us really is to take that central identity and allow it to fix what is broken with us as a group of people. Because when I get up and I try to explain some of the misconceptions, I want to be clear here that I'm not suggesting that evangelicals don't have problems. We do. I have an African-American pastor colleague of mine in New Jersey who said of the race issue, he said, I don't know that God is going to use the church to fix the race issue, but I do believe he's going to use race to fix his church. And I think we're starting to see some of that now. And that's just one example of the kind of thing I'm talking about. That churches would be more intentional in their pursuit of every nation, every tribe, every tongue, not because we hold a certain political view, because we're for or against affirmative action, but because we believe in the kingdom of God, and that kingdom doesn't leave out anybody. And so in the end, I would say our biggest issue is to be more conformed to be like the evangel, because the etymology of that term informs who we should be rather than necessarily who we are. We should conform to that which we believe is the greatest news that's been shared in the history of humanity. I think that's our challenge.
Thank you, Joel.
Yes, sir.
Our second speaker is Brian Hamilton, who is the co-pastor of Westminister DC with his partner Ruth, and was ordained on September the 9th, 1992, and has served parishes in Philadelphia, Detroit, and Westminster. He's a second career pastor, working before as a sociology professor and community developer. Brian grew up in Providence, Maine. He received his BA in sociology from Eastern Baptist College. He received his Master of Divinity from Union Theological in New York City. Brian.
It's great to be here tonight. It's great to be with all you all. I want to just try and reflect on who I am within mainline Protestantism by telling you a little bit about where I came from. I grew up in a very small town in as far east in the state of Maine as you can get, right on the Canadian border. In 1970, the census claimed that this little town had 957 people in it, and I think it probably has even fewer than that now. I grew up in a small town, American Baptist church, and this was an extremely important part of my life. I was in this setting, I think conservative evangelical, I think is what it would be. We didn't use those terms back then. This was before religion became politicized and divided up in so many different ways. But the church was such an important part of my life and part of my emotional coming of age and what has shaped my identity. When I was a teenager, I visited a Baptist church in the next town down, which was in the throes of the apocalyptic movement within Christianity. Hal Lindsey was holding forth back then, and I can remember going to a week of revival services there where a professor from the New England Bible Institute told us that based on his research and his study of Scripture, he had to conclude that Jesus was going to return within 6 months. And as an impressionable young person, I believed it. And so I went to my pastor and I said, Jesus is coming back any time here, and so I'm not sure why I'm sitting in geometry class. And so I began to ask and wonder things like that. And, so some of the logical implications of our faith and our faith claims, sometimes we don't take them all that far. Maybe we should, maybe it's good that we don't. But anyway, I survived that. Jesus didn't come back, and has yet to come back, which I believe someday he will. And so I went off and went to college. I went to Eastern Baptist, and largely under the influence of a very significant evangelist, a guy named Tony Campolo. I don't know if you have heard of him. He was a very significant individual in my life. He helped me to fuse what I understood to be a social mandate in the gospel with an evangelical faith, which was really profound and passionate, and really had tremendous energy to it. So I kind of followed him and went to Eastern, and I studied sociology, which for me was a fusion of the social gospel, which were teachings within Scripture that I always believed from my earliest time. I believed that there was an element of justice within the Christian mandate, and so that was an extremely important time in my life. I went on to study at what I considered to be more liberal seminaries, religious organizations. I went to the New School for Social Research in New York, where I studied sociology, which was a Marxist school, or considered to be a Marxist school at the time. But back then, even in our Bible studies, we were totally comfortable with the social thinking of Karl Marx, and had no problem with fusing that together with the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth. So I went on, and I taught for a little while, and then I came back to the church because I had a real longing for ministry, had a real longing for community. And these are all extremely important things, and I believe they're important parts of my upbringing. I'm telling you all this because I think one of the things that plagues Christianity in this country has to do with our social, historical context. I grew up in a small town that I could not stay in. And this is a dynamic in American culture today that is really significant. We have so many people in our country are, in a sense, spiritual refugees. In a sense, we are historically displaced for all kinds of different reasons. But I can remember the anguish that I had when I had to tell my dad that I was not going to be a resident of this little town where my family had lived forever and ever. And it felt like so much betrayal on my part. I really anguished about that for a long, long time. But the time came, my dad retired, he bought an RV, discovered the rest of the country, so he didn't care as much. He came to visit me wherever I would happen to be. But this is a story that I hear a lot from people, that they have lost their roots in their rootedness. And I think this is a real challenge in mainline Protestantism, is that people have to balance their faith in the midst of all these other pressures that people live with. One of the things that we hear constantly in this congregation is that people don't have enough time, they don't have enough money, they don't have enough energy, they're depleted. There's a scarcity dynamic that exists for us, and that feeds into and flows into our spirituality and our religious life, individually and collectively. I became a Presbyterian because while in Philadelphia, when I went back to Eastern Baptist Theological Seminary to get my divinity degree so that I could go into ministry, I needed a field work placement, and I stumbled into Old Pine Street Presbyterian Church after having tried to dig into the American Baptist world, and they didn't want anything to do with me, or they didn't have any opportunities at that time, perhaps. But this Presbyterian church was just out of the box. The pastor was a professional clown, and he used clowning as a way of doing therapeutic touch and healing. which he did at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, and he did as part of his ministry in the church and in the community. And in very creative ways, he was able to open the church up to the environment in which they were placed. And that is another of the great challenges of mainline Protestantism. We have just enough money that we become really, insular within all of that. We spend so much time maintaining our institutions, so much time maintaining our brick-heavy cathedral-like structures, that we lose the sense that the church is more than the building, and that we have much more work to do than just maintaining this institution. And these are really profound issues. So I became Presbyterian, moved to the city of Detroit, where I met my wife. 22 years ago, we came here as co-pastors, and we are still co-pastors, and we are still married after all these years. So, miracles do happen. A big part of what we do around here is really struggle with context within our community. It has a tremendous amount to do with race and ethnicity. A long time ago, 20 years ago, we started doing a jazz program here in the church as a way of appealing to an indigenous urban art form for generations had been being shepherded within the African American community as a way of simply bringing people together. So it is in one sense something that strikes me as being backdoor evangelism. Let's just set aside all of the high-level tenets that we are going to ask people later on to consider, to think about, to accept, to join. And let's first of all start to build and rebuild relationships which have been historically decimated for a very long time. We then started a blues program, which helps us also to appeal to an aesthetic and to an experience of the poor and marginalized in our community and in our whole society. And it gives us an opportunity to give voice to people who have struggled and suffered from a lot of these historical dynamics. So I am a progressive Christian. And for me, that means that I believe that God asks us to be engaged within our historical moment. It asks that we set aside and be very reflective about all of the divisions and the lines that we have drawn amongst ourselves, and set those aside and entertain our faith in a new way. Wherever we are, whatever that means, just to be totally contextual. I am very comfortable, and I believe that I learned this in my evangelical background with liberation theology. I believe that existence precedes essence, as James Cone has taught us, that we have to find ourselves, first of all, within the context in which we exist, and then we move on. And God meets us and God goes with us throughout the whole way. We have a lot of work to do. The mainline church is dying, as all organized religions seem to be in decline these days. But I believe that there's power within it all. So within this conversation, I'm really grateful to be with you all.
Thank you, Brian. Our third speaker is Patrick Carolan. He is the Executive Director of the Franciscan Action Network and has been the head of it since 2010. He's also a co-founder of the Global Catholic Climate Movement, an organization working on global climate justice issues, as well as Faithful Democracy, a faith coalition focused on the issue of money in politics, working to educate on the corruptive influence of big money on our democracy. Patrick is the recipient of the 2015 White House Companion for Change Award for his work in the climate change area. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Earth Ethics and is personally dedicated to social justice to bring about individual and societal transformation.
Thank you. Good evening. Peace and all good. I'm very grateful to Rossett and to the Rumi Forum for inviting me to speak this evening. So we're here this evening to talk about the challenges to Christianity in America. And I'd like to start off with one of my favorite quotes by Rumi, since this is the Rumi Forum. Your task is not to seek for love, but merely to seek and find all the barriers within yourself that you have built against it. So if we're asking the question about challenges to Christianity, we first must define what we mean by Christianity. And then we have to look at the barriers we have set up, both internally and externally, that get in the way of us living a Christian life. And let me say that when we're having a discussion about the challenges of Christianity in America, and the panel consists of 4 white males, I could probably end my presentation right there. But I won't, because I'm Franciscan. I also want to be very clear that I am not a theologian. My theological training consists of 2 high school religion classes, one taught by a very liberal priest and one taught by a very conservative priest, which kind of left me kind of like a spiritual schizophrenic. And I can only look at both the challenges and the barriers through my lens and my life experiences. I was raised Catholic. Today I describe myself as Franciscan, which does not necessarily also mean Catholic. There are whole orders of Episcopalian Franciscans, there's orders of Lutheran Franciscans, there's a whole order of ecumenical Franciscans, which includes Presbyterians and Baptists and Quakers and many other branches of Christianity who have come together to become Franciscan. So even in this tiny subset of Christianity, Franciscanism, there are many differences. You can only imagine, if you look at the universe of Christianity as a whole, how vast this gulf of separation is. I always believe that before we can talk about how we move forward, we should take a few minutes to reflect on how we got there. In my work, I often get to meet with political leaders on both sides of the aisle. Recently, I had the opportunity to meet with Congressman Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, and Senator Ed Markey. Different meetings, thankfully not at the same time. They're both Catholic, and they both talk about how their Catholic faith has guided them. Yet they are on opposite ends of this political spectrum. They both believe that their positions are grounded and consistent with Catholic theology, yet the chasm between their positions and beliefs is so vast that you have to ask how they can both claim the mantle of Christianity. This moral contradiction is not unique to these 2 politicians. In 1840, Bishop John England of Charleston, South Carolina, wrote several letters to the Secretary of State under President Van Buren, suggesting that slavery was not only right, but that it would be a violation of religious freedom to do away with slavery. Pope Pius IX, around the same time, wrote, "Slavery itself, considered as such in its essential nature, is not at all contrary to the natural and divine law, and there can be several just titles of slavery, and these are referenced to be approved by theologians and commentators of the sacred canons. It is not contrary to the natural and divine law for a slave to be sought, bought, and exchanged or given." While at that same time, when these 2 Catholic leaders were writing this and talking about this, John Baptist Purcell, who was a Catholic bishop of Cincinnati, was writing and preaching and condemning not only slavery, but racism. In the 13th century, one of the leading theologians in the church, St. Thomas Aquinas, defended slavery as instituted by God. And in the early 13th century, official support for slavery and the slave trade was incorporated into canon law. Is it possible for these church leaders to be at opposite polars on an issue such as slavery and racism, but still be following the teachings of Jesus Christ? And it's not just the Catholic Church that experienced this tension. Cotton Mather, who many of you know, the late 17th century evangelical leader, who many consider to be one of, if not the most socially and politically influential early American minister, wrote in his 1706 book, The Negro Christianized, that God sent the Africans into slavery and over to Christian America to learn from their masters the glorious gospel. And just as an aside, if you're interested in learning more about this, there's a great book written by Ibram Kendi called Stamped from the Beginning, The Definitive History of Racist Ideas in America. He talks a lot about the role Christianity played in the development of slavery and racism in America. And there isn't any branch of Christianity that doesn't escape from that. I would point out, including the Quakers, who initially were in favor of slavery. Pope Francis, well, let me also, before I go on, talk about Pope Francis, but another area of Christianity is the whole issue, as I mentioned earlier, we have 4 white men here. So how we treat women in our church, and this is particularly true in the Catholic Church. And, you know, this is not just an issue of can women become priests. It's an issue of how women are regarded in the Catholic Church. And so we can look at St. Augustine, another great theologian in the church. And St. Augustine wrote, in talking about abortion actually, and he wrote that the ensoulment, when God presents a soul into an infant, into a fetus, and that's a period of time when the fetus becomes human. That happens in male fetuses at 6 weeks and in female fetuses at 12 weeks. So right from the beginning, by St. Augustine, we were making the argument that women are less than men. St. Thomas Aquinas, I'm going to pick on him a lot, he was a Dominican, so we can pick on him. He also wrote that same thing, that 12 weeks for women and 6 weeks for men. And just think for a minute what that means, if you're a woman, what that really means in terms of how God views you. St. Thomas Aquinas also wrote that masturbation is a greater sin than rape. Now, the Catholic Church, and many in the Catholic Church, have spent a lot of time apologizing for what St. Thomas Aquinas wrote. But there is no universe, nowhere, where anyone, any God would believe that masturbation is a greater sin than rape. There's just nothing to argue about that. It should have been just said he's wrong. So that tells us a little bit about where we came from and how we got to where we are when we're thinking about our challenges going forward. Pope Francis was recently speaking with a group of young people and was asked, what is the greatest sin? His response is very prophetic. He said, the sickness, or as you call and say, the sin that Jesus condemns most is hypocrisy, which is precisely what is happening when someone claims to be a Christian but does not live according to the teachings of Jesus Christ. You cannot be a Christian without living like a Christian. You cannot be a Christian without practicing the Beatitudes. You cannot be a Christian without doing what Jesus teaches us in Matthew 25, which is to feed the hungry, clothe the naked, and welcome the stranger. It is hypocrisy to call yourself a Christian and chase away a refuge or someone seeking help, someone who is hungry or thirsty. Toss out someone who is in need of my help. If I say I am a Christian but do these things, I am a hypocrite. That comes from Pope Francis. So I often ask myself the question, do I really actually believe in Jesus? And if so, what does that actually mean? If I believe in Jesus, does it mean that I just go to Mass on Sunday? Do I hold my hands the right way? Do I participate in the sacraments and obey the commandments? I'm really good at that. I was an altar boy growing up. My mother and father were Irish Catholics. They took us to Mass all the time. We prayed the rosary all the time. I get very good at holding my hands the right way and praying the right prayers. But is that what it means to be a good Christian? Am I just going through the rites and rituals? In her book, Holy Thursday Revolution, Patrice Bertrot says, it means we are to deepen our purity beyond ritual observances and not let any purity practice divide us or set us up at odds with our fellows. Think about that. If we're so concerned with our rituals and our purity codes that we are not hearing the cry of the poor and oppressed and are not acting on those cries, what does that make us? Sister Elia Delio, a Franciscan sister, so beautifully describes it in her book, Making All Things New. Eucharist means being an active participant in the cosmic body of Christ. a body evolving into fullness. The cosmic person, though, through the rise of consciousness in unity in love. The gospel life is not a social agency of good works, but a life of mindful presence or oneness with God, such as sacraments do not make one a Christian. So what does it really mean to believe in Jesus? In Romans we are told that if we have died with Christ, we believe that we shall also live with him. In Matthew 28 it says, "And surely I am always with you. I am with you always." We keep waiting for Jesus to come back again. Scholars and theologians have even tried to predict when Jesus will return. Yet these passages, like others in the gospel, tell us that Jesus never left us. He has always been with us. If we walk down the street and see a homeless person, do we cross over to avoid them? Do we quicken our pace? Do we look down so as not to make eye contact? Or do we see Christ and reach out and touch their wounds? Do we see Christ in the poor, the imprisoned, and the oppressed? In her book, Beyond Apathy, A Theology for the Bystander, Dr. Elizabeth Basco states, "To be Christian is to take sides with those who are marginalized, dehumanized, and subject to violence. Whether we like it or not, neutrality isn't an option. In the face of violent activity, to hide behind the mirror of ignorance is to take sides with the powers that be." In Matthew 10 it says, "Whoever does not take up his cross and follow after me is not worthy of me." Yet we spend most of our time worshiping at the foot of the cross rather than taking up our cross and following Jesus. That's because worshiping Jesus is so much easier than taking up the cross and following Jesus. So the challenge is, what does it really mean to be a Christian? And I'm going to pick again on Aquinas. He and another theologian, St. Bonaventure, who was a Franciscan, had an ongoing debate about if man had not committed original sin, would Jesus had come. Part of the argument centered around the question, was Mary conceived without sin? Aquinas argued that if Mary were conceived without sin, excuse me, if Mary were conceived without sin, then she would not need a redeemer. And he went on to argue that Jesus came as a healer and a redeemer. Without original sin, there would be no need for a healer. Bonaventure and the Franciscans argue that Jesus' arrival cannot be limited to his role in saving creation from sin, because God's decision to become incarnate came before creation itself happened. Another Franciscan theologian, the 13th century Don Scotus, said, "The incarnation of the Son of God is the very reason for the whole creation. To think that God would have given up such a task had Adam not sinned would be quite unreasonable. I say, therefore, that the fall was not the cause of Christ's predestination, and that if no one had fallen, neither angel nor man, in this hypothesis, Christ would still have been predestined in the same way." And this is the belief that what Franciscans believe in. The Church, unfortunately, in its infinite wisdom, sided with Aquinas. Now you might be thinking, this is all very interesting, but what relevance does it have to the question at hand? You also might be thinking, this is all very boring, and why did I waste my time coming here this evening? And that's okay as well. When you think about these two perspectives, they present a completely different vision of Christianity. In the Aquinas camp, saving the soul is what is critical and important. We're here to live, die, and maybe if we follow the right path, go to heaven. That theology has been used to justify everything from slavery to war. It is what faith leaders like Cotton Mather and Pope Pius IX wrote to justify slavery. I remember as a child around the age of 12, I was in my religion class. I was being taught by a good sister of mercy. The subject was heaven and hell. And after her lesson, I raised my hand and I said, "Sister, I just want to make sure I understand this. If I'm good and I follow the commandments, when I die I will go to heaven. But if my brother is not good and he commits sins, when he dies, he will go to hell." And she replied, "Yes." And I followed up, "But sister, if my brother is suffering in hell, I will not be happy in heaven." And her response was that we all have free will, we all have had a choice, we all could have chosen to be good or bad. If your brother made bad choices, then he deserves to be punished by going to hell. My response back to her was, "Sister, that is irrelevant. It's irrelevant as to why he is in hell. If my brother is in hell suffering, then I will not be happy and content in heaven." I'm pretty sure about this time that I got sent to the principal's office. On the other hand, the Bonaventure and Scotus theology is centered on the incarnation, God becoming man. In doing so, we become co-creators with God in building the kingdom of heaven here on earth. If that is what we believe as Christians, then there would never be a justification for slavery or racism, or not welcoming the stranger or war. Gandhi once said that Christianity seems like a great idea. Someday he would actually like to meet a real Christian. So our greatest challenge is simply to first define what we mean by being Christian, and then to start living Christian every second of every day. Or to put it in another way, and I often ask this simple question, do you think Jesus came with a building plan or an evacuation plan? Peace.
Well, I'd like to thank the panelists for both some compelling personal testimony and also some very fine insight, particularly in relationship to the point Joel made, that sometimes a faith community has a title or a name, but we tend to think of it as being an entirely homogeneous group, which it is often not, that there, within these various families, there are diversities of personalities, opinions, issues, and so forth. And also the point that if we look at Christianity historically, we see that different things have been taught at different times, and there have been obvious changes in the way Christians have come to think about different social, cultural issues, and so forth. So part of my role here as a moderator, I guess, is to try to start things by way of asking some questions about issues related to what's going on in terms of religion and American culture today, and each of us, I suspect, would have our own category of things that we think are very important or among the most important. And one of the issues that I would like to hear the panel address, and this is something that has come up, Brian, you talked a little bit about this. If we look at the trajectory of mainline religious traditions, and I include not only Protestantism but also Catholicism in that, if we look at these traditions for quite some time now, we see there's very clearly been a kind of downward trajectory in relationship to everything from membership in these various churches, denominations, and so forth, financial giving, and so forth. And from my kind of academic perspective, I'm aware that there is a great deal of both empirical and kind of theoretical work in relationship to trying to explain. This goes back to the 1970s, Dean Kelly's book on why conservative churches are growing. There are all kinds of theories out there, in relationship to both what precipitated the decline of the mainline, particularly if we compare where things are now to the vitality culturally, politically, and so forth of the mainline in the post-World War II era. So one big question here is whether or not, I think Brian, you used the word dying, which kind of struck me. That's a significant way to name what's happening to the mainline. So I would just like to hear from the panelists your sense of both whether this trajectory is likely to continue. I'm assuming there's no magic social, cultural, or spiritual bullet here, so to speak, that's going to dramatically change things around. But are there things that could be done that might make a difference, that might make these traditions more appealing, if you will, or that might revitalize them in some meaningful way, that they can engage the culture, transform the culture, and ultimately redeem the culture. And sort of collateral with that, another certainly big issue today is the rise of the nun phenomenon. Usually, if I talk about this in relationship to a Catholic audience, I have to spell this out. This is N-O-N-E. This is not N-U-N. If we look at Lilly numbers, this is now approximately 23% of the U.S. adult population, more nuns than Catholics as a group, or Protestants as a group. And some would say as many, if not slightly more, than evangelicals as a group. They are the fastest rising, if you will, quote, religious demographic. And again, they've been something of an academic growth industry for the last 15 years. There's ever-expanding repertoire of theories, what have you, about who the nuns are, why the nuns are, and so forth. And we can, I think, correctly assume that there is some relationship between both, on the one hand, the decline of the mainline and the rise of the nuns. So I just open the floor to either general comments about this decline and where that's going, and then its relationship to the nuns, or what each of you would make of this nun phenomenon.
Well, I'm glad you raised that. I think that's a very, very significant thing. Robert Putnam claims that in 2006, based on that massive Faith Matters study that he was involved with, 17% of the population were within this category. 10 years later, it's 23, as you say, 24%. But amongst millennials, it's much higher than that. I'm not sure what it was in 06, but in 16, it's up to 38 to 40%, which is incredible. If you really look at the trajectories, if you try and budget out or project out, this is an absolutely stifling reality that we have to deal with. One of the things that we experience is that a tremendous amount of our members are retreads from other denominational churches. So a lot of members who join mainline churches come from a background of having been disoriented, disaffected in another congregation, so they go and join a new congregation. But in terms of evangelism, which is not a word that mainline folk like to use a whole lot, we're not digging into the segment of the population that really needs our presence and our witness. This is a tremendous factor. I have a really good friend. I just want to tell you, Reverend Al, who is a pastor in the Presbyterian Church of America, which is a conservative evangelical alternative to the Presbyterian Church in the United States of America, which is what we are. Reverend Al spent 25 years building a church in Fairfax, and he woke up one day and he said, "I'm done, I'm out, I can't take this anymore." And as he explained it to me, he says, "I am so tired of having conversations about Christian carpet and Christian coffee and Christian furniture and all of this stuff that church people tend to spend so much time and attention on, which has nothing to do with ministry or the proclamation of the gospel at all." So he quit. He just walked out. And he has been spending the last 2 or 3 years in a blues bar in Arlington, and he is in a totally different place. He's doing ministry with people who are suicidal, people who have anger issues, people who have are disaffected in so many different ways, but he's really, really connecting with people because he's gotten out of the building, gotten away from the institution, gotten out of this old stifling conversation. And a big part of this is that we are overly creedal in one sense. We spend way too much time theologically navel-gazing. And we get so wrapped up in the culture or the social fabric of our congregations. The conversations that we have are not enlivening, they're not spiritual, they're not about much of anything, they're about all the trappings and trimmings that for some reason we as first world citizens and first world Christians drag along with us. I for one, am personally excited about the prospect that we as a nation are rapidly becoming a post-Christian society. I think it's a great thing. But we got a lot of work to do.
That's an interesting issue. I mean, I've thought about this in terms of thinking of what's going on as our society, our culture, becoming more non-Christian in relationship to the presence of traditions other than Christianity. I mean, that percentage is still relatively low, but it is growing. On the other hand, I think of post-Christian. To me, this has a connotation of, been there, done that, tried that, I'm out of here, I don't like it. It's a different way to think about, and it strikes me that that's a different challenge to at least institutional Christianity if we're dealing with people where the mindset is post-Christian as opposed to just simply non-Christian or nothing in, the none category, that big slice that's nothing in particular.
I share your optimism, given the reality of post-Christian, largely because, as a colleague of mine said, that the early church itself was not raised up within the bubble of Mayberry. It instead rocketed out of a pagan Roman Empire, and an empire that to a large degree was against it. And so one of the issues, and I'm a little more optimistic about the millennials as well, largely due to the way I think statistical analysis sometimes gets skewed. For example, your friend that you just described that's playing in a pub right now and just having the time of his life, I'm sure continuing to talk to people about Jesus and probably in his own mind more effectively, right? And so, but if we were to put that on a spreadsheet, that would probably be viewed in a negative way simply because he's no longer a pastor, right? And so I think oftentimes I'm not a statistician, but confounding variables, I understand what that is. And of course, the greatest example of that being, the murder rate goes up in the summertime, and also the consumption of ice cream goes up in the summertime, right? So ice cream must cause people to become homicidal. We know that's not true because the confounding variable is people get out in the summertime and they rub up against one another and they irritate one another. And all of those things combined raise the propensity for the murder rate. When it comes to the jettisoning of millennials, I think we have to remember that it is the youngest of that generation who are just now starting to graduate college. And a huge swath of these people are still building their lives, and there's not been a single generation in American history that didn't spend some amount of time outside the institutional church during that moment of their life. And then something huge happened. They got married, they had a kid, they went through a divorce. Something happened, and they come back through. Now, what I'm concerned about with the rise of the nuns is not that they are departing, but that the chance is less that they will come back. And I think I've got to go back to my original point again, because I'm here to critique not mainline Catholicism, but my own people, right? And so the issue with evangelicalism is our core identity. What's that look like? And so for the last roughly 30 years, evangelicalism has been fairly or unfairly associated with the religious right, the moral majority, all of those kinds of things. And I wrote a piece 5-6 years ago addressing it to millennials, warning them not to make the same mistake in reverse. Political zealotism, I think, was probably the greatest mistake, blunder of evangelicals in the last century. Because what happened was, unlike Catholics actually have a very strong social thought tradition, we really didn't have one, particularly with regard to life issues. And so then all of a sudden, we began to get on this abortion train, and right cause, but our rationale was more political than theological. It wasn't very deeply anchored. And so what that led to over the years was an alignment with, and if I could be so graphic, a getting in bed with the Republican Party. And what I see now is, in the millennial generation, a right rebellion against that, but a tendency to default to the left. And so it's interesting to me because we've got a good swath of millennials, age groups are there. And again, they're not a monolith either in our congregations. I'm sure they're not in yours. But when I talk about life issues, when I talk about sexual ethics, when I talk about things that maybe cut against the grain of what the left would say in this country, I tend to get everything from deep questions to just outright letters of opposition, and they tend to come from my people who would identify as Democrats. Conversely, when I talk about the alien, the stranger, the refugee, when I talk about not castigating another religion just because you don't agree with it, when I talk about Christianity as an incarnational, not an isolationist faith, those letters tend to come from the right. And what it tells me is that our core identity, we're melting. In some sense, my fear is that we're melting down the golden elephants and we're just recasting golden donkeys. And that, I think a lot of that may be the biggest barrier to seeing those young ones come back. But I don't know that it's them. I think it's more us.
That's an interesting point, this question of how disaffiliation relates to this kind of life cycle dynamic. That is to say that there had been in much of the earlier sociological literature, there was an assumption that, as kids in a family setting, everybody went to church and so forth, and then you got away from the parents for the first time and, became less connected to church and so forth. But given marriage and children, these tend to be, or have tended to be, the two strongest predictors of whether or not people were church affiliated, going to church and so forth. But one of the problems, and this is from the context of Catholicism, one of the problems with that today, in other words, Andrew Greeley was one who assumed that all these Catholics, that they'll all be coming back someday, again, because what's happening is just this normal life cycle, period of estrangement. But in point of fact, there are three things going on. First of all, young people are waiting later to marry, which is to say they're away from the church for longer periods of time. Secondly, there are increasing numbers of Catholics marrying non-Catholics, and this is something that has some fairly serious implications in terms of intergenerational transmission of faith. And then thirdly, even where Catholics are marrying other Catholics, more of them are doing it outside the church. So I guess in one sense you could argue it ain't necessarily so, that is to say that simply because they pulled away for a while, that means that at some point they will be back.
So I just want to make a couple of points on that. First of all, I think what you were talking about and being challenged on both sides, it means you're doing your job. And so, because a friend of mine, a priest up in my parish, will sometimes up in Connecticut, will sometimes say, if I haven't made you feel uncomfortable, then I haven't done my job. As we're taught by St. Francis, we never transform in our comfort zone. So it's our job to get people out of their comfort zone in order to transform. In my experience with millennial and Catholics, and we often think that, or the assumption is, well, they're leaving because the Catholic Church is, because they're pro-choice. And that's absolutely usually not true among Catholics and millennials. They're leaving because they feel that the Catholic Church is only focusing on abortion and not on all of the other issues. And a lot of the millennials that I know, and I'm an activist, I work with lots of young people, get arrested with some of them, and they are not pro-choice. They think that we shouldn't be, passing laws to demonize. What we should be doing is to work to end abortion, but they're also looking at all of these other issues as right-to-life issues. And that's what drove them away from the Catholic Church, was that the Catholic Church was not looking at all of the other issues. It was only focusing and made the same mistake that the evangelicals made of, this is the only issue, vote on this issue, and driving the Catholic Church closer to the Republican Party. And that's what drove a lot of it. I belong to a parish in Silver Springs that is packed on Sundays. It has 9 masses Saturday and Sunday, and it is packed. It's a multicultural church. They have masses in French because there's a huge Haitian and African population. They have masses in Spanish, and they have masses in English. And every mass is packed. I've been arrested with some of the priests from that church. Some of the priests get a standing ovation at the end of their homilies, and it's filled with millennials. And so if we have the right message, if we are active in living with our Christian values, because the other thing I think is that we're not fooling kids anymore, young people. We're not fooling. They understand, they get it, they see us as being hypocritical. They're going to say, why? Why should I do that? I'm also, I have some friends in the Unitarian Church, and they were saying to me recently that the Unitarians used to be made up of predominantly ex-Catholics. And then she said, but now it's becoming ex-evangelicals. So she said, you guys have to work harder because we're losing our ex-Catholics. You have to start getting more of the ex-evangelicals. So I'm optimistic and hopeful that young people, I have confidence in young people because I stand with them out in rallies. And I have confidence that they understand and get it. They may not come back to the Catholic Church that I know or the evangelical church, but they are going to come back to God and find a way to form new churches, whatever that happens to be.
Okay.
I've got a question, and hopefully this
Yes, it is now. I thank you for your presentations, but within the light of, I think the latter part of the topic was lessons for other faith communities. For me, as an American Muslim or a new American Muslim, I have history in Australia. I'm from another majority white Christian Western society, but I've been here for the last decade, and in particular in the last few years, and these are, I suspect, issues you've read about or spoken about in regards to Muslims in this country, and to a lesser degree maybe other non-Christian faith communities, with the rise in white supremacy, some of the rhetoric coming out of higher office, what we would call maybe polarizing rhetoric are making Muslim Americans and other faith communities anxious, nervous, scared, among numerous other things. Within these communities, some are new, some are old. Are there lessons from your experience, both personally and socially, and from your personal theological makeup? What can you advise to people of non-Christian faith backgrounds, how they should be working with Christian groups or even working among themselves to handle the social pressures of not being in the majority?
So I'll start off with that. I spent last year traveling around the country as part of, we worked on a film, the story of St. Francis of Assisi and his encounter with the Sultan Al-Kamil. It's called The Sultan and the Saint. And I was invited to travel with the film around the country and speak at the premieres around the country of it. And it was to audiences that were mostly Muslim, although some Christian, but a lot of it were Muslim audiences. And that question came up over and over again. I don't know if you're familiar with the story of St. Francis of Assisi and his encounter with the Sultan, but it's a story of these two men who came together and built a relationship and became lifelong friends. And as a result of that relationship that they built, they were able to bring an end to the Fifth Crusade, an end to all of the Crusades. So the message that I got, and let me just share one little story. I was in West Virginia. I was invited to go and speak in West Virginia. And a friend of mine, Joel, who was one of the producers of the film, was also there at this event. And he invited me to come to the mosque with him on Friday afternoon to prayer. And he was giving the teaching at the mosque. And so I sat there at the mosque while he was giving the teaching. And I closed my eyes and I thought I could be in Friday afternoon mass at a Catholic church. I could be in Saturday services at a synagogue. And I would be hearing the exact same message. A little variation here and there, a little different theme. It was the same message. It was a message of peace and love. And so I think that it's important for the Muslim community to not be afraid to reach out. There's a whole project that was started in South Africa called the Damietto Initiative, based on the city in Egypt where the encounter happened. It started years ago by Franciscans and it's now grown throughout all of Africa, where it's bringing together Muslim and Christian communities in Africa. And sometimes you may have heard stories of, like in Nigeria a couple years ago, there was a bus that was surrounded by Muslim, they were not Muslim, they were terrorists. The bus had both Muslim and Christians on it. And everyone got off the bus, and these terrorists were wanting to separate the Muslims from the Christians, and they were going to kill the Christians and let the Muslims go. And the Muslims surrounded the Christians and said, no, you can't do that. And they protected them. These people were part of this Damietto Initiative. And so we have to start now, before those kinds of things happening, having dialogue, working with each other, building relationship with each other, and then start understanding, not going to say, I'm going to convert you or you're going to convert me, but let's have an understanding of the commonality of our faith, the differences of our faith. Let's not wash over the differences because there are differences, but let's respect our differences. And then let's really, because we're at the Rumi Forum, and Rumi said that we all believe in the same God, so we're all the same religion. We just kind of have a different path and journey on that religion. So that would be mine.
Well, we've been there and done that, haven't we? With you guys. And so, obviously, we keep that going. We were several of us were at a forum some weeks ago at the Marriott Marquis here in the city where we talked about this issue, and in particular, Christian and Muslim relations, and what does that look like? And so, generally speaking, the principle you want, I think, in that is the vociferous defense of the religious rights of the minority by the majority, whoever that is. So here in America right now, those are Christians of all stripes. And so whether we be Catholic or mainline or evangelical, and I'm not just an evangelical, I'm still a Baptist. And so, we're kind of the wild, wild west of the Protestant world. But one of the things that we've always been fiercely independent about and very forceful about is the idea of religious liberty. We argue now over what did Jefferson mean, actually, when he talked about that metaphorical wall between church and state. But the truth of the matter is, Jefferson would have never written those words had it not been for Baptists, who actually wrote him a letter first. That was in a response letter to a group of Baptists who believed that people ought to be able to worship according to the dictates of their own conscience. And so it really doesn't matter whether I find agreement or disagreement with a particular religious faith. We guard that. And here in the States, we advocate for the rights of others as well as for ourselves. Complete religious freedom. And of course, on the other side of the world, where whatever that happens to be, in a place like Myanmar, where it's predominantly Buddhist, and they're persecuting Muslims. In a place like Pakistan, where occasionally you have Muslims who are persecuting Christians. And there are places where we need to establish, Jefferson set this for us really well in the West. The Marrakesh Declaration, which was just recently drafted by Sheikh bin Baya in Morocco, I think is also a great model for this. So obviously, and yes, we build friendships with each other because we're part of the same human family. We work together on issues of common concern, but we do it while we have each other's back. And if one of us is sensing that there's persecution, the other needs to come to the rescue and the aid of that other individual, because your conscience belongs to God and no one else.
There's a truism out there that there's far more that unites us than divides us. And I believe that's true. What I believe one of the great challenges within Christianity is that we spend an awful lot of time talking, but what really divides us is our social reality as opposed to our theological claims. 95% of what gets between us are our social divisions, distinctiveness. And, our faith, our theology, that's much less significant. The great problem we have, not just as a Christian world, as the church, but as our society as a whole, is a tremendous social distance with which we live and tolerate. And I am hopeful that the nuns out there have not been infected with this disease that a lot of us creedal folks, so bound to the ideological, theological mandates of our traditions. They've been freed from all of that, and I'm very hopeful that they're going to lead us into a whole new way of not just rebuilding a society which has more justice, more equality, more inclusion built into it, but also about the really profound questions of what it means for us to be human and children of God. I never want to move away from the notion that we are all created in the image of God. And that we just haven't spent enough time really unpacking that and really dissecting that and living with it. I truly believe as a liberal, perhaps questions are far more important than answers. And that we don't spend nearly enough time simply entertaining, living with, absorbing, integrating the real questions with which we live and that challenge us and that plague us. That ultimately, in one real sense, we are all in this together. Our salvation, in a real sense, is us all together.